Good afternoon. Welcome everybody, wherever you are. Good morning, maybe. Good evening. Welcome to Tushita's review sessions of His Holiness teachings this morning here in India, here in Dharamshala. And I can't see your faces, so that's okay. But there's usually people also joining later and then making use of the recordings. Yeah, so we are live streaming right now. So the recordings are automatic on our YouTube channel if you are interested. Yeah. So we're waiting for Venerable Gache. He's in contact with me. I think he will join us very quickly. Thank you so much and enjoy. Hello, Venerable Gache. Oh, what's happening? You are unmuted. No, it must be his side because it shows he is unmuted.
Still can't hear me? No.
We can hear you now.
Okay, good.
Oh, is this computer you mean?
Yes, ma'am, the sound of this laptop.
Well, I think one person heard me, but maybe Kunpen couldn't hear me.
Okay, so nobody heard me even beforehand.
No, I heard also you beforehand.
But I didn't hear me, so to say.
Ah,
Okay. So I think it's okay now, right? Seems like it. Okay, I don't hear you. Oh, you're muted, Kunpen.
Yes.
Bye.
Okay, now we hear each other.
Okay.
Sorry, everybody, for these little difficulties, technical difficulties. Welcome again, Venerable Gachila from Sarah. We are so happy that you're joining us for leading these review sessions. It's very, very kind of you. We know that you have a very busy schedule. And yes, we have a few people, and I'm sure there will be more joining later, and of course, the recordings later on. Thank you so much, Venerable Gachila. And I will make you co-host because I'm assuming that you might be.
I won't need to do any sharing, I don't think. I'll just be
Oh,
going
okay.
what he talked about.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay. So yeah, welcome everybody here to Sera. What you might have today, so right at the moment it's okay, but we have a lot of construction going on in our house. So if you happen to hear some drilling, shouldn't be too loud, but if it's a problem, you let me know. So let's start as usual. We can just sit quietly for a couple minutes. Okay, so again, welcome everybody. We are at Sarajay Monastery in South India. We have a few sessions from here. Seems to be the easiest solution for the time being, although I do hope to be able to come again to His Holiness' teachings in not too distant future. Maybe some of you were there this morning for the teaching. So it was a quite short teaching, only about an hour, and as I was told, there are some other foreigners here who were listening to the translation, and they told me that the last few things His Holiness said weren't translated because he was just talking to his attendant. But it was a sort of interesting exchange that His Holiness today was going to teach on Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom of the middle way, or root wisdom. And he didn't seem like he had gotten the text at all. So as he finished his talk and said, "It's nice, thank you for all for coming, nice day," and his attendant handed him the text in Tibetan and said, "His Holiness, this is the text, root wisdom." And His Holiness sort of said, "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" And he said, "Well, you were requested to teach them this text, Your Holiness." And it seemed like he was a little bit resistant to it, but then he said, "Okay," and then he started talking, and he just said, "This is an excellent text. It's really wonderful to put it into practice. I hope you can all read it. So it's very clear. There's no need for commentary. Thank you all. Goodbye." So I guess His Holiness sometimes sees the best situation for the disciples at that time. So that would seem to be the correct advice. It was quite okay for us, perhaps. I don't know, for some of the sponsors coming from Korea, that's what they expected. But fortunately, we do have this text available, so we can follow His Holiness' advice and read it and study it. So what I'll do during this review session is just to go through what His Holiness said, and then I'll talk a little bit about the text in accordance with his advice. Think about how we can approach this text if we want to study it on our own. So His Holiness began this morning by saying, of course, that Koreans have a great interest in Buddhism. I'm sure most of you know that Korea has historically been a Buddhist country, heavily influenced by China and Chinese Buddhism. And fortunately in South Korea, there's still freedom to practice. I don't think so much in North Korea. We have a number of monks here at Sara, actually, from Korea. I noticed some of them were in the audience this morning. They're in Dharamsala. So some of them take interest to come here and study. So I've heard quite a lot about the respect that's shown for Buddhism in Korea. Actually, some of the Korean monks find that's one of the hardest things for them when they come to this community here, where actually the level of respect shown for monks is not as strong as it would be in Korea. They say that there's much, like for example, in India, where we live, within the Tibetan settlement, at least, there is a lot of respect for monks. But if you go into town and meet with local Indian people, usually you're just treated like regular people. Whereas most of the Korean monks find that most of their life they've been shown respect by lay people. So it's a bit of a shock for them when they come here. So His Holiness was saying he hopes to go to South Korea, and about talking about the people having single points of faith in Buddhism there. So they said now we have the opportunity to make a Dharma relationship with our Dharma friends in South Korea. I expect a lot of this was translated, maybe some of it wasn't, but in any case, to think about what he's been saying. And of course, then His Holiness said everyone has their own personal choice or their own independence of thought to choose whatever religion they wish to follow. It depends also upon their particular disposition and their inclination. And he was saying that there's religions that accept a creator God. And if somebody can have single-pointed faith in that and it's helpful for their mind, then that's very good. And he also was pointing out that all religions talk about compassion, have that as a prime virtue, and to abandon harm to others. And then he was saying, as a Buddhist monk, he respects all religions and has friends in many other religions. He sees them as kind-hearted people, really with a strong intention to benefit others, to hold others as more important than themselves. And he was saying that there's some of the wars these days, sometimes they're caused by politics, but unfortunately, sometimes they're caused by religion. He's saying how unfortunate that is when that becomes a catalyst for fighting. So I don't know, maybe some of you can hear the drilling in the background. I don't know how noisy it is. It's interesting. We had the course I taught for Tushita in August. It started just when we were having flooding in our house from the monsoon season. So we had quite severe leakage in our roof this year. We finally decided to build a real roof. When we say roof, we just have a flat top, a concrete slab. But so we finally are now building a sloped roof that will hopefully take care of the rain. So in future years we won't have dripping. So we waited for the dry season now to start the construction. But actually it rained quite heavily the past 2 days. It was bad timing because we'd already stripped off a lot of the roof. So we've had the most severe flooding, severe water leakage in the house that we've ever had. All of our rooms are quite wet. You might see behind me one thing that's indicative of that. I don't have any water bowls on my altar, you see. Sometimes you'll see them behind me, but that's because the power was not cut out. And we didn't want to waste the filtered water. We try and use it sparingly. So it's been an interesting time here, and we're waiting for the construction to gradually finish, and hopefully there won't be another major rainstorm in the meantime. But anyway, so if you hear this, I don't know if it comes through on the speaker, but it's quite loud here. If you hear the drilling, I hope it doesn't bother you too much, or especially if you can't hear me for any editing time, please let me know. So then His Holiness was saying, yes, about talking about his old friend, this Korean abbot, I suppose, that seemed like was one escorting him in. So I don't know what abbot, what monastery he's from. The only monastery I know of in Korea is Songwasa. Maybe some of you have heard of this. When we were in college, actually, we studied. I took a course on Buddhism, and we learned about Songwasa as a famous monastery in Korea and how they live. There's a book, very good book called The Zen Monastic Experience by Robert Buswell. So if you're interested in Buddhism as a practice in Korea, it gives a very good overview of that as his own personal experience living as a monk there when he was young. But when I came to Sera, now I've actually met quite a lot of monks from that monastery. As I mentioned, we have Korean monks here at Sera, and most of them are from Songwasa. So perhaps this abbot is the abbot of Songwasa. So then His Holiness, he gave a quotation. I actually didn't recognize it, but fortunately he said it slowly enough that I was able to write it down. So just again, I don't know how much it was translated, but it starts with Sipa Ngo Nikidak, which means that existence is pure by nature. Existence usually would mean samsara in this case. So the samsaric existence is pure by nature in the sense that it's actually the word dak in Tibetan, which I translated as pure. It can also be a negation. So like saying that something is pure means it's free of stain. So in this case, it's actually talking about freedom from inherent existence. It's pure in the sense that it's not stained by inherent existence. But then he was saying that that based on not understanding that, then one then imputes real existence onto things, and from that comes attachment and aversion, and that then becomes the cause of further samsara. And so he said it's good to reflect and consider on this point about things being pure by nature. Otherwise, we will continue to make such imputations. So then the second line of the verse, ngoniti sitache. So through this nature, then one can end, they put an end to existence. So he's saying that if you recognize that this is the things are by nature free of inherent nature, if you recognize this nature of things, so it's sort of a double play on the word nature, which is actually, we might get to that if we talk about Nagarjuna's text in chapter 15. He has the same sort of double, sort of ambiguous use of a term, the word nature, that nature could refer to inherent nature, which is the object of negation, but it can also refer to emptiness, which is the true nature of things. So he's saying if you know this nature, the emptiness, then you can eliminate the root of samsara, which is the grasping at true existence or at a self. So His Holiness, I've always meant to check on this. He always calls this term atta zimpa, the root of the grasping at self-existence. So I've gotten used to him saying that, but I don't actually know that term. I've never heard that term used in Tibetan or seen it in a text. So I have to ask one of my teachers what that actually means, but I've gotten used to him saying that, and I know when he says that, he means the grasping at true existence and the root of samsara. So he was saying this is like in quantum mechanics. He says that understanding quantum physics also allows us to have insight into emptiness, that we can see the non-real existence of the external world. And that things appear to exist from their own side, and then on that basis, then we impute that things have a special attractiveness beyond what they possess. And then from that comes attachment or aversion if we impute non-attractiveness or ugliness onto things. So all of this, again, comes from this atta zimpa, this root of samsara. So then the next line of this text, Rangjin dakpe sentenpe. So endowed with a mind that is purified of true existence or of nature. So he's saying that things are imputed by name and conceptual conceptual imputation. So we know this, by knowing this, with such a mind that knows this, then we can harm, the word harm in Tibetan is often used as a way of negating a wrong consciousness. So it harms the grasping at true existence. And then that will gradually reduce or diminish attachment and aversion. And from that, then we will get, we'll naturally have compassion as a result of that. He's saying that because when we see that things are empty, that not truly existent, we will see that other beings are trapped by their own ignorance, and then cycle in samsara as a result, and thereby will generate compassion. So then the final line of this stanza, so the third line was saying with a mind, using a mind that's purified of nature, then purify existence. So in this sense, it's talking about, because at the convention level, although at the ultimate level, it's saying that it's ultimately purified of true existence. Now we conventionally purify it in the sense that we eliminate the wrong consciousness and achieve enlightenment. So pure with a mind that's by nature pure, then purifies cyclic existence. So he's saying that means that we have the Dharmakaya, the wisdom body of the Buddha, and then the Rupakaya, the form body of the Buddha. So we attain the status of enlightenment that is the unification of the form body and the wisdom body. So he said, therefore, existence is by nature not inherently established. And he's saying that this non-inherent establishment is very kind. It's very kind to us because by seeing that non-inherent establishment, we can be free of samsara, So of course, this non-inherent existence isn't an animate thing, but it's an analogy here, a metaphor that it's very kind to us in the sense that it allows us to be free by meditating on it. If it was indeed inherently existence, then there'd be no way to be free. And so, therefore, we wouldn't be able to harm, again, this atta, that he calls the root of samsara. So then His Holiness referenced recently in the news in South Korea. Some of you might have heard there was apparently a major incident, a crowding incident on Halloween. So many people were trampled to death and died. So he was saying, that about having compassion. Yeah, he was saying he was feeling sad and having compassion for his Dharma friends in Korea, and that he would do prayers for them. Let's see. I'm not sure if that was related or because I don't have in the notes, so I can't remember if he was relating that to what he was saying or just bringing up a new subject. So then His Holiness said it's important that the monks in the major monasteries, and they do prayers, so maybe there will be something here. I haven't heard anything yet. And then he was saying that, so I can think this is how he's relating it to what he was talking about, that the main obstacle, he was talking about the importance of compassion, and then he was saying that the main obstacle to compassion is the atta, again, this grasping at true existence. So if we can be free of that, then it will naturally have compassion for the suffering of others. And he gave the example of in the Heart Sutra, when the Buddha, or actually Avalokiteshvara says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is not other than emptiness, emptiness is not other than form. So when he's saying this shows that appearances things appear as real, but are not found under analysis. So he was saying every day I meditate on emptiness and bodhicitta. That is my main practice. He's saying doing that, then that brings peace of mind and a sense of mental strength, fortitude. And he gave His Holiness quoted from the Bodhisattva vows. So some of you know the verses for taking the Bodhisattva vows. One of the lines of the Wangshen Doni of Abjukjir. So in order to actualize the purpose of myself and others, or the welfare of myself and others, he's saying that it shows that for one's own benefit, that bodhicitta is the best meditation, and also for the benefit of others, it's the best. So His Holiness was then saying the way to approach this is first through study and contemplation. That this then puts imprints in the mind to understand this. So it's not just something that we understand all at once. And from life to life, I think he was saying, I didn't quite catch this, but I think he was saying that we would work together life to life. So the point being, if you take these teachings from me now and make these imprints, then those will continue to ripen life to life, continue to understand more deeply. And His Holiness was then quoting from the Bodhisattva Charyavatara. So I think it's the fourth to last verse of the text. So as long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, until the may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. So he said, when you have such a mind that thinks that, then you have great courage and you feel sort of contentment of mind, happens naturally. So he said also, when you think about the way things that are merely imputed, then naturally will come an altruistic intention. And then that will help the situation in South Korea. So I think he was talking to the Koreans saying, how can you be a benefit if you think there's so much suffering? What can I do? He was saying, really what you have to do is transform your own mind. If you don't do that, then simply trying to change all kinds of things externally might have some benefit, but in the long run, it's not going to solve the problem if we don't, each of us, recognize the way that our own minds are responsible for creating situations of suffering. So he's pointing out many billions of people. All people want happiness and want to be free of suffering. And if they're unhappy, then there's a lot of strife. People get angry and they fight each other. So he says, what is it that's really harming peace of mind, or could also mean this peace in the world? He's saying what really harms that is attachment and aversion. And so how do we get rid of attachment and aversion, or what harms that, he said? Then that's emptiness. Emptiness can cut out the root of attachment and aversion. And again, he said, think like in quantum physics. So then he said, think first of peace and happiness for oneself, and then for family and friends, and then for the world. So His Holiness was then talking about the environmental crisis, which he said this several times, which is something to consider. He said basically we can't help it; it's out of our hands now. And then he was quoting from the Abhidharma Kosha, saying that the aeon can end in many ways, and one of them is end in fire. Things get hotter, and then they end that way. So he said that's what we see in the ecology. So he said, but that's not really that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. That really the only solution is to have peace of mind. If we can't solve the external problem, then if we have peace of mind, we'll be happy no matter what happens. And we have to think about many lifetimes. So this is only one life. This is only one existence. He said that, I don't think he said that today, but he said that quite a few times. I've heard him say that although this environmental crisis may flare out of control, certainly we'll all be born together again in the future, some other place, and continue together with this. So it's more important to think about the long term and not to be, although of course, I'm not putting words in his mouth here, but I assume he would say, we will do what we can for the crisis. We shouldn't just ignore it. His Holiness has often spoken about the importance of taking care of the planet. But at the same time, if we get so caught up in it that we become emotionally disturbed and anxious, then that doesn't really help the situation. It will only hinder our ability to be of benefit. So yeah, then he was saying it. So he was talking up to here about South Korea, and he said North Korea is a bit of a nyokdra, Tibetan word. It's sort of a bit of a trouble. But he said it's okay. We can pray for them also. And he was saying Koreans in Korea or all over the world. Then again, ask him to please think about emptiness and quantum mechanics, and about one's Dharma friends. He's saying, my Dharma friends, please do this. So he's saying, if you do this, then from life to life, it will increase. And your understanding will increase, your experience will increase, and we will do this together. So yeah, then finished the point where I mentioned, then the attendant came and said, could you please teach on root wisdom, Nagarjuna? So His Holiness, then he's talking a bit about the great qualities of Nagarjuna, the author of this text. So he said, he was the great thinker on emptiness. That we have the extensive path and the profound path we talk about often in Buddhism. Profound being meditation and emptiness, and then the extensive being the practices associated with that. So mainly the first four perfections of giving, generosity, ethical discipline, patience, joyous effort. And he said that Nagarjuna, he established these through the path of reasoning, rather than just giving quotations from scripture. And he said many Nalanda masters, Nalanda being the monastery in northeast India, as you probably know, they followed after Nagarjuna. So he said mainly the two main texts are Root Wisdom, this present text, which is for the profound or emptiness, and then Precious Garland, other text by Nagarjuna, which is the main text on the extensive practices. Again, not establishing them by scriptural quotation, but by reasoning. So His Holiness said, Nagarjuna, he was like a second Buddha. He said, sometimes I read this slowly. He says, he takes the text down from his altar, the Root Wisdom, and slowly reads through it just to consider the verses, and also with Precious Garland together with that. So then His Holiness said, we don't need what is it? Oh yeah, he said we don't need especially a commentary on this. He said it's good to put the text in a respectful place, so like on your altar or on a bookshelf somewhere high, and then read it sometimes. And he said also, if you can, to read Umalajukpa, so Madhyamakavatara, Entering the Middle Way, Supplement to the Middle Way by Chandrakirti, and also the auto commentary to that text by Chandrakirti. That's all. So please think on them. And then he said the Buddha's Dharma has been here for a long time, and now he's saying it's interacting with modern psychology. So there's been a lot of interest in what it can contribute to psychology in the modern world. Many scientists are becoming interested. I can certainly attest to that here. There are many scientists that come to Sarah. Some of them come because they're interested in Buddhism and they want to study more about it. Some of them just show up here without much knowledge of Buddhism, but they're often quite impressed by seeing the depth of the psychology, the way that it's studied here. Yeah, so he was saying, His Holiness, the classic understanding of how to approach these kinds of texts is in the three-step process. First to study, and then to think about the meaning, and then to meditate on that. So he said, please do that. Please do so. So that was the end of the talk. So there's still one more day. I suppose tomorrow he might actually talk about the text. But in the meantime, as I said, I'll give here an introduction to Nagarjuna and his philosophy, and to this text in particular. So I wondered though, before we move on to that, if anyone has any questions about anything His Holiness said or about anything I've said so far. If not, let us go right on into the discussion of the text. If you have a question, you could write it on the chat, or you can ask it. But if not, then yeah, we can move on. So again, I don't know the background of many people here, so I will assume little background. Yeah, somebody has a question. Hold on. So I had a question about he mentioned about bringing emptiness into Tantra. Okay. So, yeah, I don't think he said a lot about that. He might have mentioned in passing about that the importance of that. Would you like me to elaborate on what that might mean? Trunk and branches. Trunk and branches. I don't think I caught that if you said that. But in any case, so emptiness and Tantra. So, okay, so we have the trunk, the trunk and branches of practice, right? So His Holiness often mentions that the teachings, the exoteric sutra teachings, these are what he calls Tempa Chitsen, meaning the general teachings that are meant for a general audience. And then the tantric teachings, the Ganzab Gudzin, which would mean that something that's specifically suited to a particular person's characteristics in a particular circumstance. So it's very important. This is the Geluk approach, first of all, to separate these two. This is much more emphasized in Geluk than in other schools, to clearly delineate here is Sutra, here is Tantra. So for example, here in the monastery, we debate only about Sutra, and it's not allowed to bring in the tantric system. Sometimes we can give quotations from tantric texts if they're relevant. But to give an example, right now, actually, in our debates, we've been reading about Dharmakirti's presentation of the clear light nature of mind, which is a term used in the sutras as well, not just the tantras. So we might bring in other quotations from other texts talking about what does it mean to be the clear light nature of mind. But it would be, so as inappropriate is not quite the right word, although it would be, but it's sort of, it just wouldn't be the style of approach here that I would bring in a quotation from the tantric text talking about the clear light mind. It's like we focus first on building a foundation of understanding, based on the sutra philosophy. And then on the basis of that, then it's understood how to slowly to integrate tantric practice. So in Tantra, it's the understanding, again, this is unique to Tsongkhapa's approach, is to understand that the object emptiness is not different. So most other Tibetan schools or scholars from other traditions do not accept that point. They would say that the emptiness meditating on Tantra is a more profound kind of emptiness. But Tsongkhapa says it's exactly the same emptiness. There's no difference in terms of, when we say, does everything dissolve into emptiness in Tantra? It's the same emptiness, it's the same object. The difference is about the mind that's experiencing emptiness. It's on the side of the mind, the object possessor. We say objects and object possessors. Object possessor means mind, right? The object is what is being perceived by the mind, and then the perceiver, the one that holds that object, is the mind. So the purpose of Tantra ultimately is to manifest as more subtle level of consciousness that can thereby experience emptiness in a more direct way. So we talk about in Sutra that we have a direct perception of emptiness, but the Tantric understanding is that even what is called the direct perception of emptiness in Sutra still has a very subtle appearance of duality. This is not, in the Sutra, there's no understanding of there being any appearance of duality when one has a direct perception of emptiness. But when in the Tantric teaching, it's understood that actually that meditation on emptiness from a Sutra perspective, because the mind realizing emptiness is still the coarse mind, the coarse level of mind, then the mind itself has an appearance of duality. Has nothing to do with the object. So we talk about proliferation. You may have heard this term. So like there's many different kinds of proliferation, or sort of how do we say it? The word in Tibetan "pro" is much simpler than proliferation in English, but it means like all kinds of things that are projected onto an object. So it's not seen exactly as it is. So that there is some of that comes from a conceptual projection onto such things. And then the sutra path can get rid of that. But there is just some natural appearance of proliferation based upon the level of mind. The mind itself experiences things in a dualistic way. And so the point of Tantra is thereby to manifest a more subtle level of consciousness in order to experience that object with that subtle level of consciousness. So all of Tantric practice is geared towards that. All the other practices, the generation and completion stage, all of these things. And then we have action Tantra, performance Tantra, yoga Tantra, highest yoga Tantra, all of these. They're all just steps to reach that point where one is able to manifest the most subtle, clear light mind, as it's understood in Tantra, and then have a direct experience of emptiness with that mind. Because at that point, then there is no more experience of duality, either from the objective side or from the subjective side. So that is why it's called the Great Empty. You may have heard there's the four empties. When I say empty and not emptiness, just because in Tibetan the word is not tongpa ni, is tongpa, which would really in English empty and not emptiness. Like in Sanskrit, I believe it's shunya as opposed to shunyata. So His Holiness has said actually that he thinks when it's these four empties, they are not as different than when we talk about emptiness in the Sutra school, or in terms of the emptiness of the object, it's talking about freedom from inherent existence. Emptiness means empty of inherent existence. So we call it emptiness of being something. So usually actually in English language, when we say empty, we don't use it in that way. We think about empty as something like a pot is empty. There's nothing inside of it. But you could put something inside of it. So that thing that it's empty of, for example, the pot, you pour the water out of the pot, now it's empty of water. The water went somewhere else. Whereas emptiness in this case is emptiness of being something. So the pot is not inherently existent. It's empty of inherent existence. It doesn't mean that you can fill it with inherent existence. The point is that it is not, as opposed to has not. and that inherent existence doesn't exist somewhere else. It's just the nature of the pot not to be inherently existent. Now, the four empties are the opposite. The four empties are actually empty of possessing something. And in this context, it's empty of coarse appearance and dualistic appearance. So the four empties. So I don't want to talk too much about Tantra because generally it's not something that we talk about in a general audience. But at the same time, none of what I'm talking about is something that's too profound or that's going to be meant for people who are only practicing it. So it's just very general theory. So you might have heard about the white appearance, red increase, black mirror attainment, and clear light mind. These are the four levels of subtlety of mind that are achieved as the coarse level of gradually diminishes or withdraws, is probably a better word. Yeah, the word tim into it, and it could be like melt or sink, but that's not quite the right translation. I think dissolve is how they often dissolves into the more subtle levels of mind. So those are equivalent to the four empties. The first empty is the white appearance, which is empty of coarse dualistic appearance. Then the red increase is the second empty, that is empty of the white appearance. Then the black mirror attainment is the third empty, that is empty of the red increase. And then the clear light is the fourth empty. It's empty of the black mirror attainment, which is the most subtle level of dualistic appearance. So there's no longer any dualistic appearance. And this dissolution of the mind into the most subtle level, it's something that happens naturally to all people when they die. So it's not something that's created through Tantra, it's just something that's accessed. But most of the time when people die, there's no control of this. There's no ability to manipulate this process. So it's not really used in any constructive way. But it could be used in a constructive way, and that's what Tantra is aiming at. And it would be ideal not to have to die in order to do that. Otherwise, you lose your chance. You get one chance, and then you have to start again. So all the other tantric practices are aimed ultimately at being able to intentionally manifest that clear light mind, and then meditate on emptiness. And if one can do that, then the meditation is much more profound, and one goes through the stages of the path much more quickly. But as His Holiness often says, he's concerned sometimes people in the modern world, they like the fastest way to do something, the most expedient way, which is not a bad thing in and of itself. It's better to have a fast way if we can get one, but sometimes it's misunderstood that, well, then I'll just take the shortcut. But actually, this requires a grounding in all kinds of other practices. This is, as I said, in the monastery, here we are, studying for 25 years before we really get deeply into Tantra. It's something that requires a great groundwork. Otherwise, it at best it's just useless, and at the worst, it can actually be kind of dangerous. But the understanding, as Holiness is probably saying, I didn't catch him saying that today, but is that we just get a general understanding of what is meant to be done, so that we can think about that and have the aspiration to do that. We think that there is some ability to use this meditation and emptiness for a more in a more expedient way if we combine it with the tantric practices. So then, the next question, merely designated. Okay, so so the word merely designated in Tibetan Mingde Jaka, so merely imputed by name. So as we often say, in order to understand what's negated in emptiness and sort of what emptiness is, we have to understand what we're negating. So mere designation is what we understand once we have an understanding of emptiness. That after one has realized emptiness, then one experiences the everyday world as merely imputed by thought, created by thought. But there are many ways to understand that. His Holiness is talking from the perspective of, we say, the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the interpretation of Chandrakirti that is considered authoritative in the Gelug school. But many of the other Buddhist schools also have some idea of there being a conceptual imputation, or that the world, as we experience it, is a reflection of our state of mind. And how that functions is understood in many different ways. So one of the most extremes is the mind-only school understands that everything is simply an appearance to mind, that there is no external world other than the mind, that we have an illusion of there being a me experiencing an external world, but actually there is no external world at all, just like in a dream. The Prasangika says it's more subtle than that. Conventionally, there can be an external world. There's no problem with that on a conventional level. But what we mean by conventions is that it's simply how it appears to us, and we can talk about it in a shared language with shared conventions, that we can make statements that are mutually comprehensible and are true on a convention, in a conventional sense, but not true under deeper analysis. So there are many different examples we can use of that. One of the, I think, easiest examples to start with is to think about a particular country or city. So we can think about India in this case. So India is a real place. It's perfectly fine to say I'm in India right now. It's, if you're in a different country, if you're in Europe and you fly to India, you can say I'm flying to India. There's nothing wrong with that on a conventional level. And we can say that India, the present, at least India in the modern state of India, was founded in 1947, and that it but prior to that there was an ancient history of this country, and that this country has, what is it, 1.2 billion people, and there's a democratic system. All of these statements we can make about the country that are perfectly reasonable and correct. But actually, when we analyze what is India, then we have a big problem, and it gets very complicated. Because, well, when we mean India, do we mean physical landmass? So that is problematic, because this physical landmass predated 1947. So if we take India to mean the modern state of India, the physical landmass was there long before. Secondly, if sadly, if everyone was to leave India, if everyone from India was to move to another country and leave it empty, we probably, after a while, we would stop calling it India. There wouldn't be any state of India anymore. But at the same time, if we then say that it's all of the people, that the people are India, then there's also a problem. Because again, let's talk of this example, everyone migrates. So everyone in India migrates to Russia. Then everyone would say, we left India behind. They wouldn't say, India moved to Russia. And so there's a problem with that. So anyway, we try to pinpoint exactly what we're talking about when we talk about India, then it becomes very problematic. These are quite sort of simple examples. But some people might say, which is actually very common, I've seen this in many modern philosophies, in science books as well, the claim that, well, this India, this is a conceptual designation. We can all agree on that, as opposed to real things like human beings and sticks and stones. But in Madhyamaka philosophy, there is no difference, especially in Chandrakirti's philosophy. There is absolutely no difference from one thing to another. As soon as we have that idea, then it shows that we're grasping at true existence. Any other object that we can think of, anything we can imagine, a stick or a stone or a mind, this also is how Chandrakirti negates the mind-only school. All of these are conceptual designations that cannot be located under analysis. So we might say, well, a stick is a very physical thing that I can point to. It's not like India where there's people and land and buildings, all of these things. It's just one stick. But then the problem is we say stick, well, so we mean, so for example, is the branch of a tree a stick? Well, no, we might say it has to be a particular length. So we pick up a particular stick and say this is a stick. But then, so this is what Nagarjuna would ask. You'll see this in his text many times. So when we say, well, when you say stick, do you mean, the left end or the right end of the stick? Which one of those is the stick? Or are they both the stick, or is the composite of the two of them the stick? If you say, well, it's the composition of all the parts, it's not just one particular part, it's the composition of all of them, that is a stick. But then, okay, so if you break off one part, it's no longer a stick because the composition of the parts is no longer there. And we say, well, no, then the composition of the parts is what's remaining. It's not the whole stick, it's just that one piece of the stick. But then we already, our language has already, we say, belied our projection that we say it's a piece of a stick. It's no longer the stick. But so we say that, okay, the stick, well, where did it go? It was the collection only of that particular number of parts. But at the same time, okay, if we break it in half, we say the stick's no longer there, but how much do you have to break it in order to no longer have the stick there? So if we break it in half, we say the stick is no longer that stick. But if I take a little tiny piece off the end of it, we say, well, the stick's still there, it's just damaged. So at what point do we give up the idea that it's still a stick? So we see that it being a stick depends, or the stick, depends upon our conceptual designation. It's not just something that exists on the side of the object. Now, this is essentially Nagarjuna's analysis. It's not that difficult to understand conceptually. What is difficult to understand or to see is how profound this is. Because sometimes it can just seem, well, what does it really matter? I'll just continue living my life. It doesn't make any real difference to me. It's, okay, well, I know that in some level these things are conceptual designations, but at the same time, doing certain activities brings me pleasure, and avoiding certain things allows me to avoid suffering. And so it doesn't matter what I call them. It doesn't help to just go through these conceptual games. But according to Nagarjuna's philosophy and to Buddha's philosophy, if somebody really understands these points very profoundly, their experience of the world will change a lot. So things like a sense of who I really am. And many of us in the modern world, we have a sense that I am a product of biological evolution. And I am the composition of cells in my body. And those are composed of atoms. In Nagarjuna's philosophy, this is incorrect. This is actually comes from our way of thinking about things in a certain way, that we come to think that our conceptual construct of things is the way that they really are. And it locks us into a particular experience. And then we experience things in a particular way as a result of our way of thinking. But it's not something that we can just, say something very quickly, snap your fingers and no, I got it now. I realized I was mistaken, because it's very strong habitual way of thinking. And it's something that has to be trained in. We have to gradually try, it's said that not just about thinking, that this is why in Buddhism we do all kinds of practices, that through prolonged practice of meditation, and we say of accumulating merit and strength of mind, and at the same time considering these points through reasoning, one's experience of the world can change profoundly. Now, as His Holiness said this morning, this is not something that is meant to be taken on faith. So actually, in Nagarjuna's teaching, there's more of an emphasis on emptiness. But what we're studying right now in the monastery is Dharmakirti's second chapter of his text, Brahmanavadika, the commentary on valid cognition. He talks more specifically about the Buddhist understanding of how the mind can develop, and how through doing these practices, how mind, the yogic practice can gradually enhance over a long period of time in a way that the way that it can transform experience. So I think your question was about what does it mean for something to be merely labeled. So I think, yeah, my answer was that essentially something merely labeled means that its existence depends upon our way of thinking about it, our way of constructing it. So it's not just that what we call it depends on a way of constructing it, but its existence, the way that things existing in a particular way depends upon our way of understanding them. And furthermore, that the point of talking about all of this, about the practical side of things, is that that's something that is not just a conceptual trick. It's something that through Buddhist practice, if you look at the examples of the past masters, especially just the Buddha himself, it's to understand how to reach that state. It seems that these people, the Buddha and many other followers of him, seem to have attained something quite profound. Now, again, you have to examine that and then think about that. But His Holiness gives us a great example. We don't just want to sort of abandon our powers of thought, but at the same time, sometimes we might have very strong conceptions, very strong preconceptions about what is potential of a human being. So seeing some people like His Holiness gives us an example that maybe there's different possibilities. That human potential is quite a bit strong, quite a bit more than we might imagine. So, unless there are other questions, I will talk about Nagarjuna and his philosophy and the historical background a little bit. So, so the Buddha, most of you know, probably lived about 2,500 years ago, 583 BCE. This is currently one of the more widely accepted dates, I believe, although it's still not entirely clear. So after the Buddha passed away, because in the Buddha's lifetime, he only spoke, he never wrote anything down. I don't think there was actually writing system in India at that time. It came soon thereafter. And so his disciples, they codified his teachings in the first council, which was at Saptapani cave, just in Bihar, near Bodh Gaya. And they codified it into a canon, an oral canon. So it was not written down at that time. It was something that was memorized and passed on from generation to generation. That was standard in India at the time. All of the other major religious movements, they approach things in a similar way. There's nothing unusual about it. But gradually, India began to change. There was a lot, great philosophies arose. For one thing, there was the Mauryan Empire. So there was a lot more unification and commerce, modernization in the sense of that, how it was at that time. And as a result, some Buddhists, it seems, they didn't really take part in that. They just continued to live the same way they had before, practice the same way they had before. But some of them felt it was necessary to become involved in the dialogues that were going on, much in the way that nowadays His Holiness encourages Buddhism to participate in dialogues with science and other modern ways of understanding, rather than to simply continue to preserve ancient knowledge. And so there was the question then, we have the Buddhist philosophy, which is essentially the philosophy of karma. The Four Noble Truths are the root of the Buddhist path, the heart of the Buddhist philosophy. And the first two Noble Truths really come down to karma. The Noble Truth of suffering and the Noble Truth of the origin of suffering, which can be more extensively understood through the 12 links of dependent origination. So the 12 links of dependent origination are simply a description of how the cause of suffering, the origin of suffering, causes suffering, the truth of suffering. And what the 12 links of dependent origination are about is the function of karma. So it is saying that actions in one lifetime and mental state that lead to those actions, then that creates experience in a future lifetime. But then the question is, how does that work? It's nice to say that, and it can be helpful to meditate on that and to have faith in that, to the Buddha having said it. But as philosophy developed in India, people began to have concepts of how the world is, how things exist. And if you're going to make a claim that there are multiple lifetimes and that karmic causality functions over multiple lifetimes, then you have to be able to explain how that works. So, for example, if we have an atomistic theory of the world, everything is just the result of the interactions of atoms, then it's very, very hard to explain how karma functions. Actually, during the time of the Buddha, this will sound a little grotesque, but this is a story that is found in the Pali Canon, the Buddhist Sutras. There was one king who challenged the Buddha and said that I don't believe in reincarnation. And he said he had proved that there is no reincarnation. And the way he had proved this, being the king, is that he had taken one of the criminals who was bound to be executed and decided to use him for an experiment. So he asked his, I don't know, we say strong men or his servants, whatever we want to call them, to build a cauldron in the ground to boil this man alive and to execute him that way. And then when they threw him in the cauldron, they sealed the top and buried it underground. And he said, I didn't see anything coming out of that hole. So there is nothing that migrates to the next life. So I can't remember the Buddha's response, but often, the Buddha would never just immediately challenge somebody directly. He gives a more subtle response. So basically the point is that this doesn't prove that there's no reincarnation. If it were the case that everything that exists is based in something that's physically measurable, then it might be a proof. Of course, we could argue, well, maybe the soul went underground or somewhere else, but at least we could try to prove, well, if there's no measurable force leaving the body at the time of death, then it proves that there is nothing that migrates to the next life. So either we have to say that there is no reincarnation, or we have to come up with a different theory of how things exist. So at that time in India, many different philosophies were trying to explain how everything exists, and some Buddhist philosophers wanted to take part in that and try to explain things that in a way that made room for the Buddha's worldview. So this was about maybe 100, 200 years before Nagarjuna. So around the turn of the modern, what's the word for it? The first millennium. So we go from BCE to CE. I'm forgetting the exact term for that. So at that time, there was this movement going on, and so different people were coming up with different understandings of things. But a lot of them were quite convoluted, you might say. They didn't really explain how things worked. It was sort of begging the question. It was just that it said, well, there is karma. What is karma? Well, karma, for example, when we create an action, then it creates what we call what's the word? So anyway, the idea is that there is imprints that are created that carry the karma, and that imprint is then tethered to the experiencer, the creator of the karma, in the way that we tether a pack or load on the back of a donkey, and then that in the future life, then that person experiences that. Well, okay, but what is that? That doesn't really prove anything. Well, how does that happen? What are these tethers that are holding things in, and what is that imprint? Where is it? So you're just kind of making a system that says sounds very nice, but it doesn't really explain how that would work. And so this is what Nagarjuna was confronted with, these different philosophies. So Nagarjuna responded by propounding this philosophy of emptiness, showing that all of these concepts these people had about how things function, they weren't findable under analysis. They were problematic. And furthermore, at the heart of them, all of them assumed that there was a self, that karma functions because there is a self that goes from birth to death and then leaves the body and transmigrates to the next life. Now, all of them had a bit of a problem because it was like they wanted to have that self, but at the same time, they had to defend the Buddhist philosophy of selflessness. There is no self. So they had to try to explain that away in a way that could explain, well, how can there conventionally be a self, but ultimately there's no self? What is the difference? What is the self that's negated? What is the self that does create and experience karma? But Nagarjuna saw this as essentially they were going against the Buddha's teachings. They were then positing a self where the Buddha had not posited a self. And that actually there is a way to understand karma that does not have to make reference to a self that carries karma. And actually, it's the only real way to understand how it could work. Because there's no real way that it could work if there is a person that is inherently real, that is an inherently real repository for inherently real karma, in the way that a silo is a storage, a repository for grain. It doesn't work that way. It might be a way an analogy to think about it, and sometimes the Buddha did use that analogy, simply because it's helpful. But if we try to pinpoint exactly what it is, it's a problem. In the same way earlier, as I used the example, we could talk about India. We can make all kinds of useful statements about India, but if we think that there's a real thing called India that's like a container, and all the Indian people are then poured into that container, and then we can just locate that container, and then we can say anyone who's inside that container is Indian, and it would be all very simple. But it turns out that it's actually just a conceptual construction. There's nothing that we can pinpoint that corresponds to our concept of it. And when we understand that, we can actually start to see how karma might work. We can see that our experience of the world is dependent upon, or hinges upon, the way we can construct it conceptually. Because the real problem with karma is, how can there be a world that is where mind has a, how we say, efficacy, has some ability to affect the world. So in most modern materialistic philosophies, it's taken for granted. That is an absurdity. That what I think inside of my head would actually have any effect on the external world. It's just, we say, science fiction. And of course, if karma is functioning, that is what has to happen. But the Buddhist response to that is that this is based on a conceptual construct that's incorrect. There's no way that can work. There is no way that there can be such a thing as a mind that is simply a product of brain activity and that exists inside of a head. Well, a lot of modern scientists recognize that there's a problem. They say the mind-body problem. But it's often assumed that it will be solved. We've already pinpointed. This is often how it's presented. So that we made to the pigeonhole principle. This is the principle of mathematics. We can't find the thing, but we know where it doesn't exist, so we know where it must exist. And we don't know how mind relates to the brain, but we know it doesn't exist. It doesn't come from anything else. So it somehow must come from the brain. It's just a matter of figuring that out. But that's still an assumption. And in Buddhist philosophy, especially, that is not philosophically coherent. There are arguments against that, that in Buddhist philosophy are basically all of the different schools of Buddhist philosophy agree in some way or another. That's a wrong argument. But they have very different ways of presenting it. And the Madhyamaka philosophy, again, seems to be the most developed, the one that gives the strongest explanation of how things could be different. So I'll actually come back to those points. I'd like to if we have time. But this was just to give a foundation a framework for understanding the world that Nagarjuna was coming into. And so Nagarjuna, we think, in the first century, is also very unclear. As I often like to say, I'm here in India studying Buddhist philosophy because I find that the Indian philosophy is some of the most profound philosophy in the world, perhaps the most profound of any of the ancient philosophies. But what was not so profound, it seems, or not so highly developed in ancient India was record keeping. I think a large part of that was due to the political situation. There was rarely a stable political entity. There was no country of India, like we say modern China. In ancient China, in ancient times, there was a country. They didn't have the word China, obviously, but there was a country that was, we could say, a progression, and it's just a change of a political dynasty and now in the political regime. But it's essentially the same class of people. There's some changes, but there's certain areas, certain races of people that are forming a coherent sense of self as an entity, a functioning entity. And in India, that wasn't ever. There was some sort of glimpse of that. For example, I mentioned the Mauryan Empire, but that didn't last very long. So there was. It's very, very hard historically to pinpoint what was going on in India. But one of my teachers here at Sarah said, he said that he was formerly a Christian. He's a Western, or he became a monk. He said one of the difficulties he always had as a Christian was that his faith had to hinge upon the historical existence of a particular person. That we have to prove that all these events in Jesus Christ's life are true. Otherwise, there's no basis for the religion. But he said in Buddhist philosophy, even if we find out that there was never a person named Nagarjuna, it really doesn't matter. What's really, all that really matters is that the texts that we have that are attributed to him, do they make sense? And can they give us a coherent, secure picture of philosophy that we can use to understand the world? So that in that case, it doesn't really matter, but you could say, going on at least on what we assume to be the case, in the first century, probably there was a person, Nagarjuna, who, so he read many of the Buddhist texts, which at this point had been written down, such as the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, we call them, such as the Heart Sutra, many of you might know, that's one of the very short of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, but there are many longer ones, especially the most important one is the one in 25,000 verses. So these texts talked about emptiness, and Nagarjuna, based on his understanding of these texts, he composed his own commentaries. So he composed many texts in his lifetime, but by far the most important one, we said the central one, is this present text that His Holiness is going to teach on this morning, which for short I'll just call root wisdom. That's what we call it in Tibetan, tsawa, sherab, literally root wisdom. But in English, oftentimes it's referred to fundamental wisdom or the middle way. So in Sanskrit, mula, madhyamaka, karika. So mula, root, and then madhyamaka, so is the middle way philosophy. And the karika just means it's in verse. And then there's no word wisdom in there, but actually, I think the long version, mula madhyamaka karika, actually I can read it for you in Tibetan, phonetics. Prajna, right? Prajna is wisdom. So it's prajna nama buddha madhyamaka karika. So the root, mula madhyamaka karika, which is called prajna. Prajna nama means name, wisdom. So this is the text in 27 chapters, all about emptiness, based upon the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Based upon the different ways of approaching emptiness in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. As for Nagarjuna's other texts, in the Tibetan system anyway, we usually classify them into three categories. There is the collection of reasoning, the collection of praises, and the collection of advice. And also separately from that, there is the collection, or just simply one text, the verification through scripture. So His Holiness mentioned that his Nagarjuna mainly approaches things through reasoning and not through just giving scriptural quotations. But he does have one text where he gives many quotations from Buddhist scriptures to show that the teaching on emptiness has verification within the Buddhist teaching. It's not just something that he made up himself. That's actually quite a short text, though. So then the texts on advice, the main ones of these are what we call letter to a friend. His Holiness often teaches them that. Some of you may have read this text. And then the precious garland. So the precious garland is often included in both the text on advice and the text on reasoning, because it contains both. That's why His Holiness was saying this morning that the precious garland contains the extensive path, because it's not just about emptiness. It contains a lot about how to practice generosity and compassion and other virtues beyond simply wisdom. And then there's the collection of phrases. So some of you might have received teachings from His Holiness, like praise to Dharmadhatu, praise to the world transcender, and so forth, which really is sort of like they are disguising a teaching on emptiness as a praise for the Buddha. Is sometimes how it looks to me, that his Nagarjuna really likes to talk about emptiness. So he obviously had profound devotion to the Buddha, but even in these praises to the Buddha, it's mainly teaching on emptiness. It will be a one verse where he gives a particular presentation of emptiness and says, "Then I praise the Buddha who taught this." So it's actually, if you ever read any of these texts, it's not that different from reading his text on emptiness. And then we have the collection of reasoning. So we have 6 of these texts, root wisdom being the first one. And then we say that of these 6 texts, there are ones that explain about the object emptiness, and there are 4 of those. And there are 2 that focus more on the mind realizing emptiness, in the sense that they talk about meditation and emptiness, and not just about objectively what is emptiness. So those that talk about objectively about emptiness, then, there is, so we have root wisdom, which talks about the object emptiness, in the sense that when people say that things truly exist, then the subject matter of what they're talking about, it negates this. So this is the most direct way. And then we have a text called grinding to dust, which is negating the argument, the style of argumentation that's being used, the form of Indian logic that was popular at the time, the 16 categories of Indian logic, and showing that those don't exist inherently either. Those can't be used as a way of establishing emptiness. So some of you might have been here earlier this year when I gave a teaching on that text. And then we have 2 texts that show that although things don't exist inherently, still they can function on the conventional level. And these are both understood to be digressions from root wisdom itself. So we have the texts, 70 stanzas in emptiness, which is said to be a digression of the 7th chapter of root wisdom. It is show that although things don't exist inherently, still on the conventional level, there can still be birth and then abiding and cessation. So the function of ordinary things, we say functioning things. Everything that exists experiences creation and then abiding for some time and then disintegration. That can still function even within the context of emptiness. And then the text, Dispelling Disputes, which is a digression from the 1st chapter of Nagarjuna's text, Root Wisdom, which is dispelling a dispute that could come up if Nagarjuna says that things don't have because the first chapter is about conditions, the conditions that create something. If there aren't any conditions findable, well then, if you just said that, if you say that everything is empty of inherent existence, then your words that you're using to say that are also empty. And so they have no power to negate anything. And so your argument, it contradicts itself even as it begins. So then this text is to dispel that dispute and to show that although things are empty of inherent existence, still there can be negation of things. That negation can function on a conventional level. Then we have two texts more about the meditation on emptiness. So one of them is 60 Stanzas on Reasoning, which is a text about showing that in order to be free of samsara, we have to meditate in emptiness. To dispel, there might be the misconception that emptiness is only this special practice for people like Nagarjuna and his followers. It's not what the Buddha was saying you need to do in order to achieve liberation. But Nagarjuna is saying that actually this is exactly what the Buddha meant. When he taught the Four Noble Truths, when he talked about the truth of cessation and how to be free of samsara, he was talking about emptiness. If you don't understand that, then you won't understand sensation and you can't achieve it because you misunderstood what he was talking about. You've objectified it too much. And then finally, Precious Garland, which is about as long, actually a little longer than Root Wisdom. So it's different. And the other texts that I mentioned are all very short. The other four, other than Root Wisdom and Precious Garland. Precious Garland, again, is a letter of advice to a king. But it contains quite a lot of advice about meditation and emptiness as well. But it then talks about how to use that to achieve the state of full enlightenment. So whereas the 60 Stanzas on Reasoning are simply talking about how to meditate on emptiness in order to achieve liberation, now it's talking about the full state of a Buddha, Mahayana path. So if you are interested, as His Holiness, his advice was to read these texts, the question is how to begin. You just want to pick up the text and read it. That would be one way. Of course, unless you can read Tibetan or Sanskrit, you'll have to read a translation. Of course, the Tibetan itself is a translation. But generally speaking, I think the Tibetan translations are extremely accurate. This is what His Holiness said. But not that I could read Sanskrit, so I can't prove that. And definitely there are times when we can see that there is some issue of translation. But it was a very organized process of translating these texts over many hundreds of years. And it seems that they word for word are able to mirror, especially because the Tibetan language, some of you might know, not the colloquial language, but the written language was intentionally invented as a way of translating Sanskrit texts. I don't know of any other language that was invented that way. And so the style of grammar is a parallel to Sanskrit. So it's just using the Tibetan vocabulary, but then using the Sanskrit grammar and the style of writing and adapting that to the Tibetan language. So it makes it actually a lot easier to translate things and to maintain the meaning. But in any case, if you don't read either of those languages, then you'll be reading it in translation. So how would you approach it? So as His Holiness said, one thing also is to read commentaries. It can be good just to read the root text as well. You don't want to just not read it at all. But sometimes we might not understand it just in our first reading. So in terms of Nagarjuna, this root wisdom, there are 8 texts, 8 commentaries that were extant in India that were considered the great commentaries on his text. So the first, in Tibetan we say Kali Jigme. So the Sanskrit name, I have to read it here, is Akuto Baya. Baya. So that means completely free of fear. This was a text that was originally, Tibetans thought it was an auto-commentary that Nagarjuna had written it himself, but Sabapa made quite strong arguments that showed that it wasn't an auto-commentary. But it was still, very highly praised text, but it's not read extensively these days. I've never heard of a teaching being given on it. And then the second one was called Deva Sharma, another Indian, which I don't think this was translated into Tibetan. And then text by Gunamati Stiramati, Gunasri, Again, I don't think any of these are in Tibetan. But then the last three, Buddha Palita and Bhavaviveka and Chandrakirti's commentary. So these are the most important ones that we study. And so His Holiness mentioned Chandrakirti, his commentary entering the middle way, and then the auto commentary on that. So those are it's very useful. We say enter in the middle way. It's an apt title because it gives a lot more detail about some of the particular reasons that Nagarjuna uses to establish emptiness. So in his text, Root Wisdom, there's 27 chapters, and each of them presents a different approach to emptiness. Chandrakirti mainly focuses on two of those and gives a much more concrete examples of what's being talked about. That's why in the monastery, when we study Madhyamaka, we study Chandrakirti. We don't actually study Nagarjuna directly, only through reading Chandrakirti and then reading Nagarjuna, because it gives a much clearer way of sort of foothold for them being able to interpret what he's talking about. Now, of course, we could argue that then we're seeing it through Chandrakirti's interpretation, but at least that way we have some basis for looking at it. And then we can start to look at different interpretations. So, for example, Bhavaviveka's translation, his commentary, and then perhaps other commentaries or other ways that might be someone might understand it, and then we can evaluate those much more clearly when we have our own clear picture of what we think is happening. And we can see, well, is this person, has they really grasped and put together all of the different things he's saying, that Nagarjuna is saying. So another approach then would be to read some of the Tibetan commentaries, which are even more clear. So especially we have Tsongkhapa's commentaries, such as Illuminating the Intent, I think it's called in English, was just released last year, translated by Thupten Jinpa. So this is Tsongkhapa's commentary on Chandrakirti, and also Tsongkhapa's commentary directly on Nagarjuna, which is translated as Ocean of Reasoning, translated by J. Garfield. It's harder to read. Definitely the Illuminating the Intent is easier to read, both because in general, as I said, Chandrakirti is an easier way to approach it. And also, although J. Garfield, I think, is a very good translator, I think reading through it, there are definitely occasional mistakes. And also, just that, being as he was, J. Garfield, as I understand, is a Western philosopher who later studied the Tibetan tradition. So in some sense is a bit of an outsider to the tradition. So there are a lot of kind of, like anything, like any tradition, there are a lot of things that are just assumed and understood through being in the milieu of talking about these things that aren't immediately obvious and to somebody who's reading it from, not within that tradition. So I just find that Thupten Jinpa, who himself having trained in this tradition and being Geshe from Ganden Monastery, has a much clearer way of presenting exactly what's being said. So I find his translation. So I think those are, again, translations of text, but also if one wants to just read a presentation from a Western author intended for a Western audience, then again, I think Thupten Jinpa and also Jeffrey Hopkins, so far from what I've seen, although I don't read that extensively in the English commentaries, although I would like to read more just to be able to know what they say, people who want to read things. But of all I've read, certainly I've never found any commentator or any author who has a clear understanding and he's writing for a Western audience than those two, Jeffrey Hopkins and Thupten Jinpa. For one thing, I've never come across anything in Jeffrey Hopkins' translations that I thought was in error. I've never seen anything in his writing that I would see. It seems like he doesn't understand the tradition or something like that. It seems both of them. Thupten Jinpa, obviously, he obviously understands a lot better than I do, having been gone through the entire Geshe program and been studying it for a lot longer. So either of those. But I mentioned J. Garfield, who translated, because probably if you read Root Wisdom, I think the main translation these days is that's used is by him. I looked on His Holiness website this morning. They have it says if you want to download the text in English, click here. So I wanted to see what version they're using, but I clicked there, and it said there's an error with the website and the text is not available. So I don't know if anyone else was able to download it, but I don't know which one they're, which translation they're using, if there's another translation. Yeah, so Garfield's, yeah, that seems to be the one that that is used. And His Holiness actually, it was interesting to see. Jay Garfield, he was here at Sarah in 2015 for the Mind Life Conference, and His Holiness made some nice comments about him. Because Jay Garfield, he gave a presentation of emptiness as part of the conference, and His Holiness said something like, "For many years, I've admired your work. It's clear that you've internalized this philosophy very well. And now that I've seen your talk today, I can see that you've also started to put it into practice. So I'm very impressed by that. So it's nice to hear that His Holiness. Well, that's what I said. The book, I didn't read his translation of Root Wisdom directly, but I did read his translation of Ocean of Reasoning, so Papa's text. And as I said, I think as translations go, it's very, very good. It's better than most translations, but as I said, there occasionally, there were points that I definitely thought this was incorrect. And there were also points where I just felt that the presentation, it's, as I say, someone like Thupten Jinpa, who is kind of immersed in this system, is able to talk about it much more fluently. So there was that difficulty. But in general, yes, I think unless I find a better one, if Thupten Jinpa happened to translate Root Wisdom, then I would definitely read that one instead, but I don't think he has. So yeah, if you want to read it, I would suggest that one. And I know that Jay Garfield has also written some books on emptiness. One other author that I've been very impressed by, so if any of you have been to my courses over the past couple of years online, I've mentioned this professor from Britain, Jan Westerhoff, who's actually a student of Jay Garfield. So when I taught the course on dispelling disputes, and also the course on grinding to dust, both of which he translated with commentary, I was very impressed by his commentary. Again, it's clear he's not sort of immersed in the tradition. He's a Western philosopher, so he doesn't present it in the way that of somebody from this tradition would be, which one thing is to constantly be relating it to personal practice. But in terms of his philosophical understanding of what Nagarjuna is saying, I didn't notice anything in error. It seemed like he does understand it correctly from what I can tell. And secondly, that his ability to relate it to common examples from Western philosophy, I thought was exceptional, better than anything I'd seen. So those two texts, his commentary on dispelling disputes, I think Dispeller of Disputes is what the book is called, and then his commentary on grinding to dust, questioning the categories. But that's very difficult text, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. But in general, him as an author, so he has a book I've noticed. We don't actually have it here. I ought to purchase it just to look through it. I think it's Inside Nagarjuna's Middle Way, Nagarjuna's something like that. But it should be easy to find. Remember, it was published in 2009. Jan Westerhoff, yeah, Nagarjuna's Middle Way, something like that. So that is a much more extensive commentary. It's not a translation of Root Wisdom, but it comments, I think, mainly on the philosophical points. So not having read it, I can't say for sure, but having been very impressed by his other works, then I think it's likely that gives a very good presentation that would be accessible to people who come from Western educational background. So I had a few other things to say. In terms of, I mentioned I would maybe talk about the mind-body relation and karma and how this relates Western philosophy. So I wonder, so it seems like there's less people now, so I wonder if some people had to go, and then they'll be back tomorrow. And we have about 20 minutes left in the session. So whether it makes sense to continue now with that, or if we want to have any question and answer now, or we can also, if people want to finish early and continue with it tomorrow. I expect, unless His Holiness has a very different presentation than today, it would be similar that it would only take me about half an hour to go through that. I suppose, why don't we have questions now? And if there's not a lot of questions, then maybe I can see you, but maybe people have questions. Okay, well, if not, okay, what I'll do, I'll give a little bit of a talk now about these things. And then what I wanted to do also, which I don't have time for now, but it's good we'll have time for that tomorrow, is to explain root wisdom chapter by chapter. So we're not, this being rather long text, there's no way to go through the text in one day, but I can at least explain what each chapter is, to give an outline of it. So I'll do that tomorrow. But I just wanted to point out, so I was mentioning about atomic theory and the materialist theory. Because, as I said, I think most of us coming from a Western educational background, or even just Western cultural background, have this as a background for our understanding things, a framework for understanding things. And I think what's important is to be able to delineate or to how we say, distinguish what is something that is proven by science and what is something that is a philosophical framework for understanding evidence. Because sometimes these two are conflated quite frequently, I think, both in our speech, in our colloquial speech, but even by people who are experts will conflate these two terms. So one thing we can look at in the ancient world, as I mentioned, in ancient India, there were all of these different philosophies, but almost all of them were operating under the assumption, or not even, some of them, it wasn't just an assumption, it was something they examined, but at least under the acceptance of the idea of reincarnation. And that also most of them had some understanding that there was some kind of liberation from that reincarnation cycle, but not all of them. For example, some of you might know the Mimamsa school, heavily based on the Vedas, actually had the opinion that there is no such thing as liberation, it's impossible. But they still believed in reincarnation and that the Vedas, the teachings in the Vedas were true, and that the practices could be used to attain certain status within a better rebirth or even good things in this life, but argued against there being any kind of liberation. But then some of the schools like Samkhya and then Jains and Buddhism talked about liberation. Although as I understand it, even in the Jain philosophy, I think, maybe there's different views within that. There also seems to be some understanding that liberation is not something that lasts forever. But certainly in Samkhya and Buddhist philosophy, it is. So all of these were different ways of understanding the world we live in. And in Western philosophy, which was also developing around that time, especially in Greece, there were also many different philosophies, and some of them also accepted this, it seems, especially like Plato and Socrates first, but then we know Socrates through Plato. It looks like in their philosophy also there was some kind of understanding of reincarnation. There were other philosophers, some of you might know, like Democritus, who had the idea of atomic theory. Everything that exists is composed of small parts, atoms. The word atom, I think, means inseparable. It's a partless particle. And that everything can be explained by sort of reference to these smaller particles. All the things that exist are just a manifestation of the interactions of these very small particles. So this philosophy was then developed. So this is just simply a statement about this is how things are, nothing about what do we do, how do we live our lives. But some Greek philosophers actually then tried to base their outlook on life based on this philosophy. One of these you might know, Epicurus. The name you probably heard, even if you don't know the philosopher, because it's now associated with people who like to take pleasure in very refined things, that they take pleasure in gourmet food or great works of art, things like this, which is a fairly good representation, actually, of Epicurean philosophy, which was essentially that everything is atomically based. There is no future life. There's no escape from this atomically based this interaction of things. But it's better to try to live a peaceful life than to get into all kinds of trouble and be worried about things. And so how to make the best use of this life that we have. So this is a philosophy that at the time, there was no way to prove that everything is atomically established. Most Greek people didn't believe that. Most Greek people believed in gods, whereas Epicurus argue that the gods are just a hallucination, or that there's no, that nothing can exist beyond the physical realm that we can experience with our senses. But there was no way to prove it per se, one way or the other. Nobody really knew how things functioned. Nobody could explain why it rains. So somebody might say it's because of God creating it, or the gods, Olympian gods creating it. There was no way to use atomic theory to explain why it rains, other than just assume that it must work somehow. So the reason I mention this is to see that before it was proven, there were still many people who were trying to live their lives on the assumption that this was true. So nowadays, again, this view has become prevalent. It's become the major view of educated people, that everything is atomically established and everything can be explained through the interactions of atoms. And therefore, the corollary is that we need to find a way to live our life that accords with that, to make our life meaningful within that framework. So that's a very similar approach. But again, the question is, has it been proven any more now than it was then? To some extent, yes. We've definitely explained a lot of things with atomic theory and generally with different materialistic theories. But there's two questions. One is it explained everything? Secondly, is just because it can explain something, does it actually mean it refers to the way things are? Or does it just refer to a very useful way of talking about it that allows us to explain it? And this is exactly what Nagarjuna would take the position of, that any way that we explain things, it's not referring to an actual thing. It's just a way of understanding it. So we could have some kind of, for example, we could think in sociology, most sociologists would assume that their theories of sociology are not based on inherently real things. So like, for example, somebody like Marx and his theories of politics and class struggle, probably Marx would have agreed that there is really, that ultimately, if everything is atomically established, there's no such thing as class struggle and this and that, but it's a very useful way of thinking about it. And therefore we can explain why people behave in a certain way. And it's a better way of thinking about it, he would have said, than any of the other ones. It's not really how anything is, it's just a very useful way of explaining something that's too complicated to explain it by making reference to every individual atom and how they function. So according to Nagarjuna's philosophy, it's the same with any other, or even atomic theory, because it's interesting. We have this word, an atom, which implies that there is some kind of fundamental particle beyond which you cannot get any smaller, and that is existing and is not in relation to something else. It has its own existence. It's like we say billiard ball theory of the universe. Things interact with each other in a particular way. But the billiard balls are fundamental. You can't get any more fundamental than that. You can't talk about how internally they function. Now it's known that that's not true. So we still use the word atom, but it's known that atoms don't actually exist in that way at all. But it's still used as a reference point to explain that these are the real building blocks and the fundamental way things exist. So we can see that actually it's not the case that atomic theory turned out to be correct. It turned out to be incorrect, but we still use it to explain things and talk as though it does actually reference real things, that therefore these are the real things and everything else is just illusory. Everything else is the mental construction. So we have the fundamental things like the atom. So if we talk about the mind, this is the philosophy of many philosophers of mind, that mind is just a designation that is not a real thing, based upon atoms in the brain or cells in the brain that can be reduced into atoms. Those are real things. But really, we even know through science that that's not true. And in Nagarjuna's philosophy, that's also not correct way of talking about anything. To reject certain constructs and then adopt others as those constructs refer to real things in the world. But the same reasoning that can be used to negate mind as a real entity can be used to negate an atom or to negate anything else. So thereby, we're left with the question, materialism, it doesn't refer to the way things actually are, but the question is it still the best way to explain things? Going to give us the best framework for understanding? And for a lot of things, it does give us a very good framework. We've been able to do a lot of things with physics, make not just explain things, but also create things, technology, that we say sometimes the argument, the proof is in the pudding, that science, it's shown to be true because it's worked so well. And no other theory of understanding, no other philosophy has had close to results of that. And therefore it shows that that's the case. Now that is, in some extent, it's a very good argument. If you want to have a philosophy and it doesn't really help you to do anything, it's not, you have to start the question, is it really correct? Maybe there's something wrong with your philosophy if it doesn't allow you to make any valid predictions or to make any, to invent anything useful. But the question is, are there limits to this particular way of approaching it? And this is, in Buddhist philosophy, the major limit that it runs up against is explaining mind. This is what a lot of modern philosophers of mind are having the same question. So some of them are very resistant to the idea that there could be anything else, but as I said, some of them are coming here to our monastery and taking an interest in this ancient tradition because they recognize that the tradition that they're coming from doesn't explain things in as clear a way as were explained by these ancient Indian philosophers. One very good article on this was in Scientific American some years ago by Christoph Koch. I don't know, Koch or Koch, I don't know how to pronounce his name actually. K-O-C-H, Christoph Koch, philosopher in America, who came to one of the Mind and Life conference actually in Ed Drapo Monastery. And he talked about, in this article, about how impressed he was and how he realized that there was this whole different tradition of understanding the mind that had come up with insights that were not understood in Western philosophy. So there's some contribution that can be made there. And also, as an example of this, actually, I had put this aside. I was going to read this. So I was looking recently at some books for purchasing. I'm the librarian of our house here. So on Amazon. So sometimes we look at the say the reviews, customer reviews. This was a very interesting review. It really gave a concrete picture of somebody with this kind of viewpoint that I'm talking about. I'll just read it up to you, and then I wouldn't have a lot of time, but we can. I think what I've already said probably will make it clear to you how I would respond to it. But it's very interesting to see. So this is a review of a Buddhist book in the Tibetan bone tradition, which is one of the pre-Buddhist religious traditions in Tibet, but has very much merged with Buddhism now. So it's sort of it becomes almost like a Buddhist philosophical school. But in any case, the reviewer, he wrote this. So first of all, he was impressed by the book in itself. What he was concerned about was the philosophy underlying it, as you'll see. So he said, an account of dream and sleep yoga within the Tibetan Bon Buddhist tradition, or the Bon tradition which significantly predates it. Lucid dreaming is one focus. Inevitably, the question is asked, dreaming is to lucid dreaming, as supposedly waking experience is to ? So that the author of the text, Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, he is comparing waking life to lucid dreaming. But this reviewer, he's asking, so are you saying that life is like a dream? But what does that say? So the reviewer, he continues, an easy analogy which may be empty. I respect the depth of learning, experience, and compassion of the author and teacher. He has lots of good advice on practices, not just for would-be lucid dreamers, but would-be conscious beings in general. The extensive Buddhist philosophizing leaves me a little cold. How many thousands of words and thoughts does it take to assert that the ultimate reality is entirely beyond words and thoughts? That the material world is just an illusion. These kinds of subjectivist, idealist ontologies have many flaws, gaps, and contradictions. Medieval and pre-medieval fantasies, lacking much in empirical or verifiable consequences. Did they even know about the organic brain? Very physical, very material. Severe damage due to injury or disease will quickly convince you that minds are built out of brains, so to speak. They do not pre-exist in the void and imagine them. I mean, really, what a load of nonsense. Go study some modern neuroscience, physics, chemistry. So that's the end of the review. So to sort of piece together, because this is what we like to do in debate, we try to take anybody's argument and try to take out what is the argument that's being made. This is sort of a polemical argument, you might say. It doesn't really present it in a syllogistic fashion. But if we were to take it out, I think there were two main arguments there that are being made. One is an appeal to reason, which is an interesting argument. One is essentially this argument I mentioned before, the proof in the pudding argument. So just to put the word physics, chemistry, as if this proves that this is wrong. So, well, what about physics and chemistry? It doesn't give any detail, but it seems to be saying, well, science has already shown that this is all wrong. We all know that science is right, so this can't be true. So that is not really an argument. It's just sort of, as they say, an appeal to authority. That's one question. But the other question he is making an argument is that if we damage the brain, therefore it harms conscious experience. This is a very common argument and a very good argument. If the mind is not a product of the brain, then why does damage to particular regions of the brain damage particular aspects of conscious experience? Now, what he says that I don't agree with is that this thereby makes it obvious and proven to anybody that the mind is a product, is built out of the brain. Now, what it does prove, and this is how we talk in Buddhist debate, philosophy, is that there is a relation between the brain and ordinary consciousness. So it does not prove that it's a cause-effect relation. It proves that there is some kind of, it's a correlation in science. But there are many ways that things can be correlated. So one example that could be a counterexample is we could say, well, when I damage particular parts of the radio, then the signal is damaged in very specific ways. So it is clear that the sound, the signal is coming out of the radio. And therefore, if I keep dissecting the radio, I'm eventually going to find where that sound is coming from. But that's not how it works. The radio simply, we say, acts as a receiver for something else. So it's a necessary condition for that thing to manifest, that sound to manifest, the radio waves to then manifest as sound. But it doesn't show that it's the only condition or the cause, the fundamentally, we say, the substantial cause of that thing. Secondly, in terms of damaging particular regions of the brain, actually, that's not entirely true, I would say, because that is true ordinarily, but not always. And what is said in science, it's called the Wind's principle, that the extraordinary can tell us a lot about the ordinary, but the ordinary cannot tell us about the extraordinary. Meaning that if there is just a few cases where that's not the true, then it shows that it's not actually exactly what's happening. So for example, you might say the hippocampus is how memory is stored. But if there are even there's one person who has a damaged hippocampus, but still has perfectly functioning memory, then it shows that it's not actually a necessary condition, even though in most cases, without it, memory doesn't function properly. And there are actually some cases, enough that it's clear that a lot of these things don't work that way. And the main cases for these aren't cases of children with brain damage, because it seems that if a child has a particular, for example, particular region of the brain removed before the brain develops, then other regions of the brain will take over the function that part of the brain would have functioned as, and the person will function perfectly fine. So for example, the visual cortex, if that does not develop properly, then the visual cortex, what we call the visual cortex, the interactions that are necessary for vision to function, can take place in the different parts of the brain, because it hasn't developed enough that it's sort of fixed in that area. But in ordinary people, adults, then if that area is removed, then there will be no vision. So the argument would be, well, therefore, that is what vision is a result of that particular region of the brain. But it's shown from the example of children that it's not the case. It's just that for most people, the brain has gotten used to using that particular region to make vision function. And thereby it is not able to adapt to a change because it's already quite fixed at that point. So this would be an argument against this argument that it's been proven that mind is a product of a material brain, or that just simply the different damaging particular regions of the brain, that it has particular effects on conscious activity. So as I said, I think what these ancient philosophers offer us is a different way to approach the evidence. They don't have a lot more evidence per se. What they do have, actually, I should qualify that, ancient Indian philosophers had a lot more experience with meditation. And they experienced a lot of things in their meditation that most modern philosophers are not aware of. So I like Alan Wallace's analogy, saying that it's like when Galileo, some of the church members would refuse to look at the telescope because they already knew before they looked that Galileo was wrong. So at the same way, to say that people who meditate seriously and have such experiences are wrong, it's possible you could give reasons why they're wrong, but simply to say that it's impossible that can happen because I haven't experienced it, it's a bit of a problematic argument. These people in ancient India, they were not just tripping out on weird experiences. They were very disciplined people who had a strong tradition of mental training that allowed them to experience things that ordinary people do not experience. So they had some degree, I would say, a different evidence, but also what they had was a different philosophy, as opposed to the Western philosophy that has sort of evolved from this theory of atomistic theory that has allowed us to explain a lot of things, but we see maybe it's just one way of explaining them. Indian philosophy has a very different way of approaching it, and that's what Nagarjuna certainly gives us. So with that, we can be finished for today. See what His Holiness says about the text tomorrow. Thank you all. Again, if anybody has any questions, you can ask. Otherwise, yeah, we'll continue tomorrow at 4.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Venerable Gache. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you all. So see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Venerable. Thank you.
Thank you.